This is 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice crackled through the line. There's a suspicious teenager in our neighborhood refusing to obey instructions and showing aggressive behavior, said the HOA president. 20 minutes later, I watched in horror as police officers surrounded my deaf 13-year-old son on our own sidewalk, all because he couldn't hear someone shouting at him. What these people didn't realize was that I'm not just any mother. I'm a former civil rights attorney, and they just picked the wrong family to harass. How did an ordinary afternoon walk turn into a $1.2 million judgment that changed disability laws across the state? I never expected to return to law after I retired early to care for my son. But sometimes, life forces your hand in ways you never anticipated, and injustice awakens parts of yourself you thought were dormant. My name is Sarah Mitchell. 5 years ago, I left my position as a senior partner at Donaldson and Blake, one of the most prestigious civil rights law firms in the state. I'd spent 15 years fighting for others, but when my husband David passed away suddenly from an undiagnosed heart condition, our son Ethan, who was born completely deaf, needed me more than my clients did. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career advocating for people with disabilities, only to fully understand the daily challenges when raising my own son without his father. Ethan is the light of my life, thoughtful, brilliant with technology, and despite what happened still manages to see the good in people. He has his father's eyes and analytical mind, but a gentleness entirely his own. When he was diagnosed with profound hearing loss at birth, David, a software engineer specializing in accessibility technology, devoted himself to developing tools that would help our son navigate a world designed for hearing people. We communicate through sign language, which Ethan mastered by age 3 with remarkable fluency. He uses cutting-edge visual aid technology that connects to his smartphone to navigate the world. It translates ambient sounds into visual alerts, allowing him to feel his environment in ways many don't understand. David helped develop some of that technology before he died, his final gift to our son. I still remember the day Ethan first tested the prototype, the wonder in his eyes when he could see the doorbell ringing or know when a car was approaching from behind. Dad made the world speak to me in my language, he signed that night. 3 months later, David was gone. After 2 years of struggling alone in our old neighborhood, where memories of David haunted every corner, I decided we needed a fresh start. 3 years ago, we moved into Parkview Estates, a manicured suburban paradise with excellent schools and proximity to Ethan's specialized hearing clinic. The homes were beautiful, tree-lined streets perfect for afternoon walks, and neighbors who waved as we moved in. I thought we'd finally found peace after losing David. What I didn't account for was Barbara Winters, Parkview's HOA president for 15 consecutive years and self-appointed neighborhood watchdog. At 62, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and always dressed in tailored business attire, Barbara was a former real estate developer who had retired early after a successful career. She ran the HOA like her personal fiefdom, holding court every month in the community center where residents either aligned themselves with her vision or faced her subtle retribution. Most tolerated her obsessive enforcement of bylaws because property values had skyrocketed under her leadership, a fact she mentioned in every conversation. Our troubles began during our very first week. Barbara appeared at our door with a 22-page HOA welcome packet, highlighting in yellow every regulation she thought we might struggle with. When she noticed Ethan wasn't responding to her questions about school, she looked directly at him and spoke louder, enunciating exaggeratedly as if volume could cure deafness. "He's deaf," I explained, signing simultaneously to Ethan. "He can't hear you, but he can read lips somewhat if you face him directly and speak normally." Barbara's professional smile tightened, her eyes flickering with something between discomfort and annoyance. "Well, that's inconvenient. We have noise regulations here, but I suppose that won't be an issue for your family." She laughed at her own joke while I forced a polite smile, feeling Ethan tense beside me as he read her lips. Later that night, Ethan asked me, "Why did that lady talk to me like I'm broken?" It took everything in me not to march back to Barbara's house. Instead, I explained that some people don't understand disability isn't something to fix, it's simply a different way of experiencing the world. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't discover until after the incident, was that Barbara had immediately called an emergency HOA board meeting after meeting us. We later obtained the minutes during legal discovery, a smoking gun that made even our attorney gasp. discussed potential property value impact of residents with special needs. Board member Jensen suggested monitoring the situation for possible covenant violations that could encourage early resale. They had been watching us from day one, looking for any excuse to push us out. Despite this underlying tension, we built a wonderful life in Parkview. Ethan thrived at his new school, where they had an excellent program for deaf students. He made friends with the Johnson children next door, Emma and Tyler, who eagerly learned sign language with the enthusiasm only kids can muster. Their mother Susan, a pediatric nurse with boundless compassion, became my closest friend and confidant. Mr. Chin, a retired teacher across the street who had a deaf cousin, started a neighborhood sign language club that several families joined. Those Saturday morning sessions in his sunlit living room became a cherished community, a place where Ethan felt completely understood. But Barbara and her inner circle, particularly Gerald Hoffman, the retired banker who served as HOA treasurer, and Patricia Vaughn, who documented every infraction with her ever-present camera, kept their distance. They watched from their porches, whispered when we passed, and documented every perceived violation with their phones. Once, after Ethan accidentally bounced a basketball into Barbara's prized hydrangeas while playing with neighborhood kids, she appeared at our door with an invoice for $300 for landscape remediation. Another time, she left a passive-aggressive note because Ethan's special accessibility ramp to our front door was not pre-approved by the architectural committee, despite the ADA explicitly protecting such modifications. "You can't just make changes because your son has special needs," she told me during one particularly tense confrontation. "Everyone has challenges. If we made exceptions for everyone, this neighborhood would look like a carnival." I tried multiple times to build bridges. I invited Barbara to Ethan's school performance for Deaf Awareness Month, where he played piano beautifully, feeling the vibrations through a specialized floor panel his father had designed. I offered to host an information session about communicating with deaf community members, even bringing in a specialist from the university. She declined every overture with a thin excuse and tighter smile. What I didn't realize was that Barbara had been quietly rallying support against us, holding private concerned citizens meetings in her sunroom where she convinced certain neighbors that accommodating disabilities would somehow devalue their investments. "First it's ramps, then it's industrial equipment," she reportedly said. "Before you know it, we'll have group homes on every corner." But all of that simmering tension, all those sidelong glances and whispered concerns, were about to boil over on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in October, a day that would change not just our lives, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to truly belong. The day began normally. Ethan had been at the Johnsons' house working on a science project with their daughter Emma. At 4:30 he texted me that he was walking home, a 3-block journey he'd made countless times before. Ethan had his noise-canceling headphones connected to his visual alert system, a sophisticated device that translates surrounding sounds into visual notifications on his phone. It seems counterintuitive for a deaf person to wear headphones, but they're an essential part of his adaptive technology. Unknown to me, Barbara had spent that morning in a heated argument with the city about a proposed accessibility ordinance that would require neighborhoods to improve sidewalk access, improvements that would be partially funded by HOA fees. She was already fuming when she spotted Ethan walking past her house. From her front porch, Barbara began shouting, "Hey, stop right there." Ethan, of course, couldn't hear her. His eyes were momentarily on his phone, checking a text notification from me. Barbara's voice escalated. "Don't you dare ignore me. I know you can read lips. This is exactly the kind of disrespect I've been talking about." She marched down her steps, gesturing wildly. Ethan's device did alert him to movement nearby. When he glanced up and saw Barbara, he smiled politely, the way I'd taught him to acknowledge adults, and continued walking. That polite smile was the match that lit the fuse. "You think this is funny?" she shouted, her face reddening. "Stop right now or there will be serious consequences." By now, Mr. Chin had come outside, having heard the commotion. "Barbara, the boy is deaf," he called out. "He can't hear you." "Oh, I know all about his so-called disability," Barbara snapped back. "His mother uses it as an excuse for everything. I've seen him respond when he wants to. This is selective hearing if I've ever seen it." Mr. Chin was stunned. "You can't be serious. That's not how deafness works." "I've had enough of your social justice lectures, Chin," Barbara said dismissively. Some of us are trying to maintain standards in this neighborhood. As Ethan continued walking, oblivious to the confrontation erupting behind him, Barbara pulled out her phone. Her fingers shook with indignation as she dialed. Mr. Chin, realizing what she was doing, immediately called me. But Barbara was already speaking to the 911 operator. What we didn't know, what would later send shockwaves through our community, was that this wasn't the first time Barbara had called police on residents she deemed problematic. The lawsuit would later uncover 7 previous incidents involving minorities and elderly residents. But we were about to become case number 8. I was reviewing case files for a pro bono disability rights consultation when my phone rang. Mr. Chen's voice was urgent. "Sarah, Barbara's calling the police on Ethan. She's telling them he's being defiant and aggressive." I tried to stop her. I dropped everything and ran. No coat, no purse, just my phone and house keys. My mind raced with every headline I'd ever read about misunderstandings between police and deaf individuals. How tragically they could end when officers misinterpreted lack of verbal response as defiance. As I rounded the corner onto Maple Street, I saw a scene that will forever be burned into my memory. There, on the neighborhood sidewalk with the tree-lined street as a backdrop, stood my son. Ethan was frozen in place, his young face a mask of confusion and fear. His gray button-up shirt was neatly tucked into his jeans, the clothes I had laid out for him that morning for his science project presentation. To Ethan's left stood a uniformed police officer, Officer Davis according to his nameplate. Tall and imposing in his dark blue uniform, utility belt gleaming in the afternoon sun, he was looking directly at my son with a stern, questioning expression. His stance was professional but authoritative, clearly trying to get responses from a child who couldn't hear his commands. And to Ethan's right, the most infuriating sight of all, Barbara Winters, arms tightly crossed over her business blazer, her face contorted with anger as she glared accusingly at my son. Her body language screamed hostility, feet planted firmly, shoulders squared, chin raised in self-righteous indignation. It was exactly as I had feared. My deaf child caught between law enforcement he couldn't communicate with and the woman who had deliberately put him in this situation. "That's my son," I shouted, running toward them. "He's deaf. He can't hear you." Officer Davis turned, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon before recognizing I was a concerned parent. "Ma'am, please stay back. Please," I begged, slowing my approach and forcing my voice to steady despite the panic flooding through me. "My son is completely deaf. He can't hear your instructions. He's not being defiant, he literally cannot hear you speaking to him." I stepped directly into the tableau, positioning myself protectively near Ethan. I quickly signed to him. "It's okay. I'm here. This is a police officer. You've done nothing wrong." The relief on his face was immediate and heartbreaking. He signed back rapidly. "Mom, why are they stopping me? I was just walking home." Officer Davis watched our exchange with dawning comprehension. "Ma'am, we received a call about a teenager refusing commands and behaving suspiciously." "He's deaf," I repeated, my voice firm as I stood beside my frightened son. "He has been since birth. He communicates through sign language." Barbara remained in her rigid stance, arms still tightly crossed, her expression now mixed with defiance and emerging discomfort as she realized others were gathering to watch. "He deliberately ignored me," Barbara insisted, her voice sharp. "I called out multiple times. He looked right at me, smiled mockingly, and kept walking when I clearly demanded he stop. Because he can't hear you." I fought to control my temper. "He was being polite by acknowledging you with a smile. He couldn't hear what you were saying." Officer Davis looked between us, the situation clarifying. "Ma'am," he addressed Barbara, "you were aware this young man is deaf?" Barbara's posture stiffened further. "Everyone uses that excuse for him. If he can't properly respond to adults in this neighborhood, he shouldn't be walking around unsupervised. It's a safety issue." The collective gasp from neighbors who had gathered was audible. Even Officer Davis looked taken aback. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly. "You called emergency services because a child you know to be deaf didn't respond to your verbal commands?" Barbara's righteous expression faltered slightly, but her arms remained firmly crossed. "He's a liability in this neighborhood. What if there had been a real emergency? What if he stepped into traffic because he couldn't hear a car horn? I stepped forward, placing myself between Barbara and my son. So you created an emergency by calling armed police on a deaf child? How exactly was that protecting him? Officer Davis's radio crackled as his partner, who had been speaking with other neighbors, approached. Davis, I've got multiple witnesses confirming the boy is deaf and was simply walking home. They're saying this isn't the first time Ms. Winters has had issues with the family. The officer turned to Barbara, his professional demeanor cooling noticeably. Ma'am, misuse of emergency services is a serious offense. As the confrontation on the sidewalk continued, a black SUV pulled up. Chief Michael Garcia, head of the local police department, stepped out. This was no coincidence. Officer Reynolds had recognized the potential for disaster and called his superior. Chief, Officer Reynolds said, this is Sarah Mitchell and her son Ethan. There appears to have been a misunderstanding. Chief Garcia approached us, his expression grave. Ms. Mitchell, I believe we met at the Disability Awareness Workshop last month. You spoke about communication challenges between law enforcement and the deaf community. I nodded, surprised he remembered. I implemented those training protocols you suggested, he continued. Unfortunately, not quickly enough. He turned to Barbara, his demeanor changing instantly. Ms. Winters, this is the 8th call you've made about suspicious individuals in your neighborhood in the past year. Each time our officers found nothing criminal. This stops today. Barbara's face flushed. I'm the HOA president. It's my responsibility to. It's your responsibility to not waste police resources and potentially endanger innocent residents, Chief Garcia interrupted. We'll be reviewing all your previous calls. In the meantime, Officer Reynolds will take your statement about why you felt a deaf child walking home constituted an emergency requiring multiple officers. The neighbors watching fell silent. No one had ever seen Barbara publicly challenged before. The chief turned back to me. Ms. Mitchell, I'd like to personally apologize for this incident. We're going to make this right. It was at that moment, watching the chief of police apologize to my son in sign language, that I knew this wasn't just about one incident. This was about changing the system. As the police left, having warned Barbara about false reporting, the neighbors remained. Barbara tried to slip away, but Susan Johnson stepped forward. Is this what our HOA fees pay for, Barbara? Harassing children. You don't understand, Barbara replied defensively. I'm protecting our property values. That's my job. From what? I asked, finally confronting her directly. From children with disabilities. From families who don't fit your narrow definition of desirable neighbors. Barbara's mask slipped. Look, I'm sorry if your feelings are hurt, but the fact remains that certain situations affect everyone's investment. If he can't communicate normally, he shouldn't be walking alone in the neighborhood. It makes people uncomfortable. It's a liability. The collective gasp from the neighbors was audible. Even Barbara's usual supporters looked shocked. Did you just suggest my son doesn't belong in public because he's deaf? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Barbara realized her mistake too late. She backtracked. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant, said Mr. Peterson, a retired judge who lived across the street. And it's a textbook violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. He turned to me. Sarah, I spent 30 years on the bench. If you decide to pursue this legally, I'd be happy to connect you with some former colleagues. That night, after putting Ethan to bed with reassurances that he'd done nothing wrong, I sat in my home office surrounded by legal textbooks I hadn't opened in years. The muscle memory returned as I began researching precedents. What I discovered, cross-referencing HOA bylaws with Barbara's enforcement pattern, revealed a disturbing trend. Families with elderly parents, residents with visible disabilities, and the neighborhood's few minority households had received over 80% of violation notices in the past 3 years. I called Jessica Winters, a former colleague who specialized in disability discrimination. By morning we had a strategy. By afternoon we had filed the initial paperwork. Barbara Winters and the Parkview HOA were about to learn an expensive lesson about inclusion. The lawsuit triggered a discovery process that revealed far more than we expected. Former residents came forward with stories of being harassed until they moved. HOA meeting minutes showed discussions about maintaining neighborhood standards, that thinly veiled discriminatory intent. Most damning was Barbara's email correspondence with board members. In discussing our request for a modest accessibility modification, if we allow this ramp, what's next? The whole neighborhood turning into a hospital. Property values will plummet when potential buyers see those people living here. The police department's internal investigation revealed that Barbara had called 911 on a Latino family having a birthday party, an elderly man who took too long checking his mail, and a black real estate agent showing a house. Each revelation strengthened our case. Each deposition dug deeper into the HOA's discriminatory practices. But nothing prepared us for what the digital forensics team discovered on Barbara's personal devices. A private Facebook group administered by Barbara, called Keeping Parkview Pristine. In it, she and select neighbors discussed strategies for making undesirables uncomfortable enough to leave. Photos of my son walking alone with vicious comments. Plans to use the HOA Architectural Committee to deny modifications requested by disabled or elderly residents. When confronted with this evidence during deposition, Barbara's attorney immediately requested a recess. They returned with a settlement offer, $50,000 if we signed a non-disclosure agreement. I declined without hesitation. This wasn't about money. This was about making sure this never happened to another family. The trial began on a rainy Monday in April, 9 months after that fateful confrontation on our neighborhood sidewalk. The county courthouse steps were crowded with news vans and reporters. Our case had touched a nerve, revealing the hidden discrimination many families face behind the manicured lawns of America's planned communities. Inside, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity, not just with Parkview residents, but with members of the deaf community, disability rights advocates, and families from other HOA neighborhoods across 3 counties. The back row was filled with elderly residents from Sunshine Gardens, a nearby retirement community where Barbara had previously served as property manager before being quietly dismissed, a fact our investigation had uncovered. Barbara arrived flanked by her legal team from Harrington and Powell, a firm known for defending HOAs against discrimination claims. She wore a conservative navy suit, pearl earrings, and an expression of wounded dignity. Her attorney, Maxwell Harrington, opened with a narrative that painted her as a misunderstood community servant. Barbara Winters has dedicated 15 years of her life to maintaining Parkview Estates as a premier residential community where families can feel secure in their investment and safe in their homes. Their defense strategy shifted notably from pre-trial depositions where they had denied discrimination entirely. Now they claimed Barbara acted out of legitimate community safety concerns. Harrington dramatically described scenarios where Ethan's inability to hear car horns or emergency vehicles could lead to tragedy. Mrs. Winters was thinking of this child's safety, not his disability, he insisted. That narrative began crumbling on day 2 when Officer Davis testified about Barbara's call. She specifically complained about the boy refusing to listen and disrespecting her authority, not about safety concerns. The police body camera footage played in court showed Barbara's crossed arms and hostile demeanor contrasted sharply with my son's confusion and fear. But it was Ethan's testimony that truly shifted the atmosphere in the courtroom. At 14 he looked small behind the witness stand, but his posture was straight, dignified. With an interpreter beside him, my brave son described in clear, thoughtful signs how the incident made him feel. I didn't understand why the police were there, he signed. When Mom explained that Ms. Winters called them because I didn't respond to her, I felt like I didn't have the right to walk in my own neighborhood. Like being deaf made me dangerous. Jessica, our attorney, gently asked, "Ethan, do you understand now why Ms. Winters called the police?" His answer, translated by the interpreter, silenced the courtroom, because she thought broken people should stay hidden. But I'm not broken. I just experience the world differently. Several jurors wiped away tears. Even the court reporter paused for a moment. One by one, witnesses dismantled Barbara's claims of community safety. Susan Johnson testified about watching Barbara photograph Ethan whenever he played outside alone. Mr. Chin described overhearing Barbara tell prospective buyers on a neighborhood tour that most residents here are normal, productive people. Officer Davis detailed Barbara's history of questionable calls targeting specific residents. Digital evidence proved most damning. Text messages between HOA board members referring to our family as the problem on Maple Street, and Barbara's emails outlining strategies to encourage turnover in homes occupied by non-standard residents. Former neighbors, including an elderly couple who sold their home after receiving 32 violation notices in 3 months, described being harassed until they moved. Barbara herself proved to be her worst advocate. Under Jessica's skillful cross-examination, her carefully constructed facade of community concern crumbled. When asked directly whether she believed people with disabilities had the same rights to enjoy the neighborhood as others, Barbara hesitated just long enough before answering, of course, that everyone in the courtroom felt the lie. Ms. Winters, Jessica pressed, in your 15 years as HOA president, how many community events have you organized specifically to include residents with disabilities? We don't discriminate by having special events, Barbara replied stiffly. Everyone is welcome at all events. And how many of those events provided sign language interpreters or other accessibility accommodations? Barbara's silence spoke volumes. No further questions, Jessica said quietly. On the 5th day of trial, after just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. As the foreman stood, I gripped Ethan's hand so tightly my knuckles went white. He squeezed back, his quiet strength flowing into me. On the claim of discriminatory harassment under the Fair Housing Act, we find for the plaintiff. On the claim of failure to provide reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, we find for the plaintiff. On the claim of intentional infliction of emotional distress, we find for the plaintiff. Victory on all counts. The damage phase began immediately. During impact statements, I spoke not just about Ethan's trauma, but about the larger implications. When communities exclude those who are different, they don't just harm individuals, they diminish themselves. They lose the rich diversity that makes neighborhoods truly thrive. The jury's damage award stunned even our legal team. $1.2 million in total, $750,000 in compensatory damages from the HOA, $250,000 in punitive damages from the HOA, and $200,000 personally from Barbara for intentional infliction of emotional distress. But Judge Eleanor Washington, a former civil rights attorney herself, wasn't finished. In an unusual move, she added injunctive relief beyond what we'd requested. Mandatory disability inclusion training for all HOA board members statewide, a court-appointed monitor for Parkview's HOA for 5 years, and a requirement that Parkview establish a disability inclusion committee with real authority over community planning. Furthermore, she added, fixing Barbara with a stern gaze, this court refers this matter to the district attorney for consideration of criminal charges for filing false police reports with discriminatory intent. As the gavel fell, marking the end of our long battle, Barbara hurried out a side door, dodging reporters who had gathered to capture the historic verdict. Her attorney issued a terse statement about exploring appeal options, but the community's judgment was already clear. By nightfall, Barbara had resigned from the HOA via email. By the end of the week, a for sale sign appeared in her yard. The neighborhood she had sought to protect from difference had ultimately rejected her vision of enforced conformity. The ripples from our case spread far beyond our neighborhood. State legislators introduced Ethan's Law, requiring HOAs to undergo anti-discrimination training and prohibiting retaliation against residents requesting reasonable accommodations. In Parkview, the transformation was immediate. Susan Johnson was elected HOA president. The first board meeting under her leadership was held in American Sign Language with voice interpreters, a symbolic reversal that made national news. Ethan became something of a local celebrity, invited to speak at schools about deaf awareness. The viral video of Chief Garcia apologizing to him in sign language sparked a nationwide conversation about police interactions with the deaf community. But the most meaningful change came 6 months after the trial, when the Ramirez family, whose son uses a wheelchair, moved in across the street. The entire neighborhood came together to help them move, and the HOA proactively approved their accessibility modifications before they even asked. As for Barbara, I saw her one last time at the supermarket a town over. Our eyes met briefly. She looked away first. I felt no satisfaction, only hope that she had learned something from losing everything she valued: her reputation, her position of power, her sense of superiority. Sometimes people ask if the lawsuit was worth it, the stress, the exposure, the years spent in litigation. I always think of what Ethan signed to me the night after the verdict. Mom, this wasn't just for me. It was for the next deaf kid who wants to walk home without being afraid. My son taught me that justice isn't just about winning in court. It's about changing hearts and systems so the court isn't needed next time. If you're raising a child with a disability or if you yourself live with one, remember this. The world may not always listen, but that doesn't mean you should stop speaking up. Your voice, whether spoken, signed, or expressed through legal action, has the power to transform communities. They called 911 on my deaf son for refusing to listen. But in the end they were forced to hear us. And that made all the difference.